After World War I, from the shattered remains of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a new Kingdom of Hungary was created. Being on the losing side of the war, the new Kingdom of Hungary lost many of its territories, which had a significant percentage of Hungarian population. In addition, the size of its armed forces was limited by the Trianon Treaty, signed on the 4th of June 1920. Hungary was also in a perilous situation, as it was surrounded by countries with which it had no friendly relationships. Between late 1918 and mid-1919, Hungary was invaded by the newly formed Czechoslovakia and by Romania. Whilst the war with Czechoslovakia was a Hungarian military victory and was low in casualties, Romanian troops entered Budapest in August 1919. Putting an end to hostilities which had left over 3,000 dead on either side. Furthermore, in March 1919, the short-lived Hungarian Soviet Republic was founded under the de facto control of Béla Kun, and, politically, the country was volatile. The Hungarian Soviet Republic would fall on August 1, 1919, to be replaced by the Hungarian Republic, and then, in 1920, the Kingdom of Hungary. While on paper Hungary was a kingdom, in reality the country was led by the regent, Vice Admiral Miklós Horthy. Hungarians never accepted the possible return of the Habsburg monarchy and, during a national assembly, chose Miklós Horthy as a regent. Miklós would remain in this position from 1920 to 1944. During the 30s, Horthy embarked on a campaign of attempting to find stronger political and military allies which could help the Hungarians regain lost lands. As the Western allies, France and Britain, seemed to be indifferent to Miklós's requests, he turned to Germany and Italy for support. While these countries later supported Hungarian territorial claims, they also provided them with military support, which included armored vehicles such as tanks in the following years. Welcome to a new Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. This time around we'll do something a bit more special. We'll be doing a nation page from our website. These pages are used as a hub from where you can access all the other pages and as an overview of the history of the nation within that time period and of the vehicles this nation has used. In this case, we're talking about Hungary during World War II. If you like our content, do check out our website. There are hundreds of articles, well researched and well illustrated there for your enjoyment. In 1922, the victorious Entente powers decided to allow the Hungarian police to acquire a small number of armored cars. One of the first armored cars developed was the Raba VP. Only one vehicle was built and was used by the police force. In the late 20s, the Entente powers partially relinquished the ban on arms and weapon purchases, and so the Hungarian army tried to acquire foreign armor car designs. The army began negotiations with the Vickers company to purchase some armored cars. The negotiations were unsuccessful, and only one Crossley 1929 and two Vickers 1929 armored cars were obtained. These were known as the 29M Crossley and 29M Vickers in Hungarian service. They were mainly used for crew training up to 1930. The Hungarian army was unsatisfied with these cars' overall performance, but they could do little to change this. During 1929 to 1932, the Hungarian army modified 12 Fiat 2F trucks to be used as training vehicles. These vehicles were lightly armored using mild steel armor and were armed with 2 machine guns. Luckily for the Hungarian army, an engineer named Nicholas Straussler began working on a new type of armored car in the early 30s. He was working at the Weiss Manfred Works, a weapon manufacturer from Budapest. Straussler would first design the AC-1 prototype, followed by the AC-2 armored car. The AC-2 would be adopted for service within the Hungarian army as the M39 Csaba. It was armed with a 20mm anti-tank rifle and an 8mm machine gun. Some 61 were ordered in 1939, followed by 32, of which 12 were command vehicles with improved radio equipment and no 20mm gun. The Csaba vehicles would be used by the Hungarian reconnaissance units during the war, but a few were also used by its police force. It also achieved some export success as the British ordered some 53 AC-2 chassis. For a short time, from 1919 to 1920, the Hungarians also operated some 20 Raba 4x2 modified anti-aircraft trucks. Interestingly, the Hungarian army managed to bypass the Trianon Treaty ban regarding the use of tanks. This was simply done under the excuse of acquiring new equipment for the police force. From 1928 on, the army sent a number of delegations to the UK, Italy, and Sweden in search of new tank designs that could possibly be adopted. The first vehicles to be purchased were 3 Carden Loyd Mark VI tankettes from the UK. From Italy, some 5 Fiat 3000B, the Italian version of the French Renault FT tank, and at least 6 Swedish M21-29 light tanks, based on the German LK2 design, were purchased. As these were mostly obsolete, they were mainly used for troop training and gaining first experience with such vehicles. In order to find a more modern tank design, a Hungarian delegation visited Italy. The Hungarians and Italians had good military cooperation, which led to the acquisition of large numbers of military equipment, including tanks and aircraft. In 1944, the Italians began selling the CV-33 and 35 light tanks to Hungary. Some sources note that the Hungarians also obtained a license for production of these tankettes. In total, some 152 would be operated by the Hungarians. These were known in Hungarian service as the 35M for the CV-33 and the 37M for the CV-35, but also known simply as Ansaldo. One flame-throwing version based on the Italian vehicle was also acquired. The Hungarians would change the machine gun type used by this vehicle and add a command cupola on some 45 of them. While the Italian fast tanks were acquired in relatively large numbers, they were fairly obsolete as fighting vehicles. For this reason, the Hungarians tried to find a more modern type of tank. They managed to buy a single Swedish L60 light tank in 1937. After a series of test trials in 1938, the Hungarians obtained a license for production of this vehicle. Initially, Mavag was chosen as the main manufacturer of this vehicle. Later, due to production problems, the Gantz factory was also included in its production. Due to a general lack of capacity and industrial capability for the completion of the first series of 80 vehicles, some parts had to be imported from Germany and Sweden. This tank was known in Hungary as the 38M Toldi A20. It was armed with a 20mm Solthon anti-tank rifle and a 34-37M machine gun. While other 3.7 or 4cm caliber guns were considered, these were not adopted initially due to the need of redesigning the turret. During 1941, another production order for 110 more vehicles, marked as the 38M Toldi 2 B20, was placed. The only difference between this and the earlier version was in minor details, and an increase in the use of domestically built parts. These were completed from May 1941 to December 1942. As the 20mm main weapon was toothless by this time of the war, it was replaced with a 40mm gun. The Toldi 2s that were modified with this gun were simply called 38M Toldi 2A B40. The last modification was called 38M Toldi 3 C40, but only fewer than 20 vehicles were produced during 1943. In the hope of increasing the firepower of its tanks, one Toldi was modified and equipped with a 7.5cm anti-tank gun, being often called the Toldi Pancselvadas, which means Toldi tank destroyer. Due to a lack of production capacity, only one prototype was made. The Toldi tanks were also modified as ambulance vehicles, designed to help with the evacuation of any injured tank crewmen during combat. With the implementation of the Huba-1 program in June 1937, the Hungarian army increased the financial resources available for the expansion of its armored force. With this program, the Hungarian army finally openly rejected the terms of the Trianon Treaty and began increasing its armored force. According to this program, it was estimated that 2 motorized brigades, equipped with 36 light tanks and 13 armored cars, would be formed. At this time, there were even attempts to develop a domestic tank design. Hungarian engineer Nicholas Straussler, beside his armored car, was also working on a tank design. His development would lead to the construction of a prototype simply called V3 in 1933. His second, much improved model, named V4, would be completed by 1937. The V4 was protected by a 26mm strong armor and was armed with one 40mm anti-tank gun and 2 additional machine guns. This vehicle was presented to the Hungarian Army officials, but due to constant requirement changes, it would not be adopted and only one working prototype was ever built. Another reason why it was never adopted was the adoption of the Toldi tank. In 1938, a Hungarian military delegation again visited Sweden and, on this occasion, showed interest in the Landsberg L62 dual-purpose anti-tank anti-aircraft vehicle, armed with a 40mm Bofors gun. As the Hungarians already produced this gun and the Toldi, which shared many components with the L62, it was logical to adopt it. For test and evaluation purposes, one L62 vehicle was purchased. After a series of test trials, the Hungarians introduced some changes, like the increase of the open-top turret size and adding more ammunition. The initial order for 46 vehicles of the 40M Nimrod, as this vehicle was known in Hungarian service, was placed in 1940. Some 135 would eventually be built. While this vehicle could engage ground and air targets, the Hungarian army intended to use it primarily as an anti-tank vehicle. The single-purchased L62 was modified to be used as an ambulance, named Lehel S, and as an engineer support vehicle, the Lehel A. Depending on the source, it may also have been intended as an armored personnel carrier. Due to the lack of production capabilities, only one prototype of this auxiliary version was built. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Hungarian army was interested in acquiring even more advanced design tanks. Initially, a great interest was shown for the Swedish Lago tank, but due to its delayed development, it had to be dropped. The Hungarians tried to approach their German allies during 1939, but without success. The Italians proposed their M1139 tanks, but to the Hungarians it was obvious that this was an outdated design. The Italian M3040 was a more promising design, but it was not to be available for some time, so another solution was needed. One solution was to negotiate with the Czechoslovak Škoda company, now in German hands. After some negotiations and German approval, the Hungarian army chose to use the T21, or the T22, the sources are conflicting, as a basis for a new tank. However, some changes were made by the Hungarians, such as having an enlarged turret with 3 crew members, adding a new 260 horsepower domestically produced engine, and using a 40mm gun, as this caliber ammunition was already in production. The new vehicle was designated the 40M Turan, inspired by the old prehistoric tribes of Hungary. Production began in August 1941, being carried out by Mavag, Ganz, MVG, and Manfred Weiss. The production orders would change several times due to war demands and, by 1944, some 279 were built. While the Turan was the most modern Hungarian tank with its 40mm gun, it was outdated by the standards of 1941. For this reason, in May 1941, development of a new 75mm tank gun was underway, but due to the lack of industrial capacity, it was only ready in May 1943. Once ready for production, this vehicle was designated simply as Terran II. While over 300 were ordered, only around 180 were built by 1944. The last attempts to increase the Turan firepower were made by installing a long barrel version of the 7.5cm gun. While a single prototype was built, due to problems with the gun development, no serial production was possible. Another prototype version built using the Turan chassis was a command version with improved radio equipment and a fake wooden main gun, but beside the prototype, no other vehicles were built. Due to the Turan's obsolescence and witnessing the use of the German Stug 3 assault guns, the Hungarian army requested that a similar vehicle be developed. This vehicle would be built using the Turan chassis and armed with a 7.5cm anti-tank gun on the 44M Zarini 1 or a 10.5cm howitzer on the 43M Zarini 2. The Zarini was named after Nicolaus Graf Zarini, famous for fighting against the Turks during the 16th century. While the anti-tank version was not adopted for service, the assault version would be built in small numbers, around 72 vehicles, and would see extensive action against the Soviets. There was also a proposal influenced by the German Marder series to build a similar vehicle. For this purpose, the Turan chassis was to be armed with an anti-tank gun. While 6 prototypes were to be built, there is no proof that this was ever implemented. This was it for the first part of our videos about Hungarian World War II armor. Join us next time when we will be talking about the TASS project, the use of Hungarian armor on the Eastern Front, and the use of foreign vehicles by the Hungarian army.